is so rare as a day in June, to quote James Russell Lowell. And this is a beautiful June day of 1982 as I stand here in Oakland Cemetery. And I had never realized until this year really why it was called Oakland. But it should be called Oakland because it is a land of oaks. There are white oaks here, there are red oaks, black oaks, bur oaks. And I was talking to Leon Levers, who's an authority on trees, and I asked him how old he thought some of these oaks were. And he said that possibly some like this behind me might be 200 years old. And there are some that were set out when the cemetery was platted back in 1839. And then there are some of these that are very, very tall. I asked him for an estimate on how tall he thought possibly they might be. And he said, well, some of them could be 90 feet, and then, of course, others where there is plenty of space and then they can spread out, then they may only get to be 65 or 70. But there are also hickories in this area. Then there are some spruce that were planted a little bit further over. So it is a beautiful cemetery. And we're going to walk through here today, and then we'll go over to St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery, and then to Memory Gardens, the three cemeteries in Iowa City. And I was visiting with Jack Bach today, who takes care of St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery, and I said, Jack, what do you think? How many people are buried in these cemeteries? Well, we kind of batted it back and forth a bit, and we finally came to the conclusion it's probably between 25 and 30,000. Probably 10,000 in St. Joseph's Cemetery, 15,000 in Oakland Cemetery, where we're standing right now, and several thousand, 2,500 in Memory Gardens. Those are ballpark figures, and so, of course, no one can challenge us on it because no one really knows. But today we're going to have a walk through Oakland Cemetery, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it with me because we will be going past the graves of people who have contributed much to the development of Iowa City, to the county, to the university, yes, and nationally. And we'll find graves that I didn't realize were here. I always stumble onto some new, interesting grave, graves of people who were important. So I'm sure we'll find it very, very interesting, and we will start now and go through the cemetery. It's logical that we should start here at the grave of Governor Robert Lucas. Governor Robert Lucas was the first governor of Iowa. He was a governor of the territory of Iowa. In the early years, before Iowa became a state, the governors were appointed. Governors are always appointed for the territories. And Robert Lucas was appointed by President Martin Van Buren July 3rd, 1838. And it's interesting that Robert Lucas, who is buried right here with his wife, Friendly Lucas, had also been a prominent politician in the state of Ohio. He was in the legislature over there for 14 years. He was governor of Ohio in 1830 and another term in 1832. So he was a very, very prominent figure in Ohio. His wife, as I say, was named Friendly. Her name was Friendly Summers, and she was quite a vivacious, charming lady, and she certainly was a great credit to him with all the politicians that called at their home at Pikeston, Ohio, which he called Friendly Grove after her. So Friendly and Robert Lucas are buried here. Their home, Plum Grove, is down on the just south of Kirkwood Avenue. They built that in 1844, and they lived there until he died. Well, she lived after that, but he lived there until 1853 when he died at the age of 71. It's rather interesting. Lucas was born, somebody has to be born on April Fool's Day, and Lucas, who was a stern, rather, well, he looked so serious, It seems odd that he should be one who was born on April Fool's Day. But he was really not that stern as his pictures look like. And if you like coincidences, his granddaughter, his great-great-granddaughter, was also born on April Fool's Day. She was born 199 years later, however, and born in Iowa City. She was born 2 years ago, and so now she's just a young lady, and it's rather interesting that the two of them were born on April Fool's Day. Close to the grave of Governor Robert Lucas is the grave of Chauncey Swan's wife and daughter. His daughter, Cordelia, is the first person to be buried in Oakland Cemetery. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in the very southwest corner, the first part of the cemetery to be utilized. And Cordelia Swan died September 18th, 1839. She was only 5 years old at the time. Then later in 1847, February 11th, her mother, Dolly Swan, died, and she was buried here also. Chauncey Swan is not buried here. After his wife died in 1850, he got California fever, as they called it. He went to the gold rush in California, and after it took 6 months to get there overland, so when he returned, he came back by ship around the tip of South America, and as he was coming into the harbor in New York, he died. And so Chauncey Swan was buried at sea. As I mentioned in one of my earlier programs, Chauncey Swan was one of the three men who selected the site for the capital of Iowa and for the city of Iowa City. So this is the Chauncey Swan grave for his wife and daughter. And over here a little ways is the grave of Eli Myers. Eli Myers and Philip Clark were the first settlers to claim land in Johnson County. And they claimed land about 2 miles south of Iowa City. And Eli Myers is buried down here right by the steps as you come into the cemetery. And Philip Clark is buried over in St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery, and we will go over there later. They came to Iowa City because they had met John Gilbert, the old Indian trader who we mentioned in our last program. They had met him in Rock Island, and he told them about this land, and so they came out and staked out their land in 1836, went back to Elkhart, Indiana, got their tools and their families, and they came back out here in 1837 and settled their claims and lived on until they passed away. Then down this way also is a man who was very, very prominent in early Iowa City history, Peter A. Dye. Dye was the engineer who was a big factor in the building of the railroad from Detroit to Chicago, and then the building of the Rock Island Railroad from Chicago to Rock Island, and then from Rock Island to Iowa City. When he reached Iowa City, he was quite taken with the future of this town, the possibilities, and so he went back to Syracuse, New York, to talk to his sweetheart, Catherine Thompson, to try to tell her that Iowa City was a place for them to live. She was a little fearful because she thought there were nothing but Indians and ruffians out here. But he drew her the plans of a house that he planned to build for them on the north end of Dubuque Street, a beautiful vantage point overlooking the Iowa River to the north and to the west. And he drew these plans and he showed her, and he convinced her that it would be a beautiful life for them in Iowa City. So they were married. They lived in that house the rest of their days, and two of their sons and their wives spent the rest of their days in that house. It's the first one on the west side of the street after you leave the university president's house. It's now owned by the university. And then over this way is the Lemuel Patterson grave. Lemuel Patterson was the most prominent attorney in Iowa City for many years, and he built a beautiful home on the corner of Dodge and Washington Street. And while he was living there, his daughter married Willard Welch, who became a prominent merchant in Iowa City selling china and silverware. And they lived with Lemuel Patterson in this fine house. The Dresden China store was known for years and years, and even today you'll find china around Iowa City in antique shops with the name Dresden behind it. This house that he had on Washington and Dodge Street, the northwest corner, had a beautiful sunken garden down below. There were goldfish ponds down there, lovely gardens. It was a beautiful place. Well, now we'll move on to another part of the cemetery. Thank you. Oh, here is a find. Walter Terrell's grave. Well, I've been up in this cemetery many, many times, but I never did see this grave of Walter Terrell before. I feel like I found an old friend. Walter Terrell had the dam and the mill site and the mill up right in front of where the Mayflower Apartments are today. And Walter Terrell built the dam in 1843. Well, this is really a surprise, and here are the other members of his family, too. Well, here is his daughter, Mary Terrell Kulakowski. Mary Terrell grew up in this house right in back of the mill, the mansion that they had. And then after she graduated from the university, she went to Chicago and did social work at Hull House. And while she was in Chicago, she met a man named Adam Kulakowski, who was a Polish count. And she became quite interested in him. And then they decided to be married. And so they came out to Iowa City, and they were married in the Terrell mansion. Mrs. Roy Mercer, who's a present-day Iowa Citian, told me that she was one of the bridesmaids for the wedding. And I see here that after they went back to Chicago to live, but after they died, their funerals were in Iowa City, and you can see here Mary Terrell Sanders Kulakowski. And over here you will see her husband's grave, Adam H. Kulakowski. Kulakowski came to the United States along about 1913 to learn the way meat processing was done in Chicago. And while he was here, World War I broke out, and either he couldn't go back to Poland, he had been a Polish count, he either couldn't go back to Poland or he didn't want to go back. Anyhow, he stayed in Chicago. And so Mary Terrell Sanders married the tall, dark, handsome, Polish count up right where the Mayflower Apartments are today. Well, it's delightful finding these two graves up here. I didn't realize that they were buried here, and I didn't know where the Walter Terrell grave was. So it has been most interesting to find them. I'm standing here at the Chalmer Close plot in Oakland Cemetery. The Close family were a very, very important family commercially in Iowa City. I have written, I believe it's 4 articles for my series in the Iowa City Press Citizen about the Close family, their commercial pursuits, their social, their cultural life, and also their philanthropic contributions to Iowa City. There were the 3 brothers, as I mentioned, and this is where Chalmers Close and his family are buried. In the olden days, back in the 1880s, 1890s, it was a custom for the more affluent families to have special plots, special little small cemeteries in the cemetery. And you'll notice how this one is built up higher than the ground around it. And there is this granite enclosure all the way around the lot. And then there, of course, are the stones of the different family members. And so it was something that the more affluent families did. Not many, but there were a few. People remember the Chalmer Close family most importantly for the beautiful mansion that they built down on South Gilbert Street, 538 South Gilbert. That's the northeast corner of Gilbert and Bowery Street. It still is a magnificent mansion. When it was built in 1874, it cost $15,000. which at that time was a lot of money. That probably was the most costly house that was built in Iowa City back in those early days. The house had 8 fireplaces, and 4 of the fireplaces downstairs had beautiful 5-by-7 mirrors above them, above the marble mantels. And they were a magnificent fireplace, still are. The 4 upstairs fireplaces did not have the mirrors on them. Recently, the Scoutstead family, who have recently bought the close mansion and are restoring it, actually they bought it at public auction for $174,000. And they restored the interior, and now they're restoring the exterior. But when they were restoring the mirrors, they took the backs off of them, and they found that they were padded with newspapers. And the newspapers were dated 1874 and 1875. And they had many interesting, I've been down and looked at the papers, and they're very, very interesting, the different types of news that they printed at that time and the advertisements. And so when they put the backs on the newspapers, they put these Massachusetts newspapers back in place, and they also put in some Iowa City Press citizens of the present era, so that when the next time the mirrors are restored another 100 years, why, then they'll be able to see what the Iowa City news was at that time. The Colden family were very influential in commercial circles. They started right across the street from where their mansion is. They had a candle factory and a linseed oil factory. And the house at 538 South Gilbert Street was heated with steam heat from the linseed oil factory across the street. They had a tunnel under the street, and when you go down in the basement of the house, you can see where the tunnel came in and where the heat came in. So the house was quite outstanding. And then later, the family were connected with the paper mill at Coralville. That was a big institution. They ran 24 hours a day. They made paper from straw. And as I recall, there were 30 people that worked around the clock. And then in 1866, they had a terrible explosion which completely destroyed the paper factory. 6 people were killed. One man was shot so high in the air that he landed on the top of a barn a block away, and they didn't find him for a day. It was a terrible explosion. That paper mill is out where the Iowa River Power Company restaurant is today. So the Close family have had a very interesting life in Iowa City, and in 1890, Mrs. Chalmer Close, after her husband had passed away, gave $10,000 for the building of the YMCA building in Iowa City. It was located on the corner, the northwest corner of Iowa Avenue and Dubuque Street, where the zoology building is today. The city and the university contributed some, but of course $10,000 in those days went a long ways. There were 4 granite pillars on the front of that house, and one of those pillars was purchased by a man named Pickering, and it's over in the far reaches of the cemetery on his stone, and he has his name engraved in this round pillar of granite, which we will see later on our trip. So the Close family were a very, very interesting family and contributed much to Iowa City. Thank you. I'm standing here at the Hornstone. This is sort of a landmark in Oakland Cemetery. It's at the extreme northwest corner of the cemetery, right at the intersection of Governor and Brown Street. And Mr. Horn, whose stone this is right here, it's another one of those ornate ones with an entrance, a step up. And Mr. Horn ran a department store on Clinton Street, right south of where the Iowa State Bank is today. And Mr. Horn always stood at the entrance of the store. He shook hands with everybody that came in. And then when they left, if they hadn't purchased anything, Mr. Horn very politely inquired why they had not purchased anything. He was not trying to embarrass them. He just wanted to know what he didn't have that they had wanted. So Mr. Horn was a prominent merchant, and he died, as you will notice on the stone over here, in 1898. And this step here that I just came up is dated 1899. So this is sort of a landmark in Oakland Cemetery. This is the memorial that is dedicated to our fallen heroes. It was dedicated May 30th, 1896, and it's located right by the high flagpole where the memorial exercises are held each year. If you're wondering where the flagpole is, you can recall it's right as you enter Oakland Cemetery, just as you go through the gate. Each year the services have been held at this point, and always in the past, until this year, the parade has been led by Will J. Hyack. And he's led the parade up here ever since 1921. In the first years, he rode his horse up here. Then as he became older, he rode in a Jeep, an open Jeep. And finally, the last few years, he walked up the hill, flanked on either side by his two sons and by his three grandsons. This year, of course, Hyack was gone. He died earlier in 1982. And so, in tribute to him, a dramatic gesture, they had a riderless horse lead the parade up the hill. So this is where the services are held. There is a squad of soldiers who fire the 3 volleys from over here. Then they play taps. The different military organizations make some comments, and then the major address is made by the speaker, who is over here at the lower end, down below where the road comes up. Now we'll go on over to Governor Kirkwood's grave. Governor Kirkwood was a Civil War governor, and he is was very much loved by all the soldiers in the Civil War. Oh, here's an old familiar name, at least it's familiar to me, Sanxay. It's a hard name to pronounce, S-A-N-X-A-Y. The Sanxays were French Huguenots, and they came to Iowa City in 1840. They came from Cincinnati. They were merchants. They went down the Ohio River and then up the Mississippi River to Muscatine and then cross country. They brought their merchandise with them, and they started their store, the first mercantile store in Iowa City, on the corner of Iowa Avenue and Clinton Street, where Iowa Book and Supply is today. Sanxay was in partnership. It wasn't Frederick, it was Frederick's son that had the store. That was Theodore had the store, and he's buried over here in another grave close by. But anyhow, Theodore was in partnership with a man named Murray for 3 years. Then that partnership terminated, and he carried the store on by himself. Then later, he moved down to where the Whetstone building is today. In fact, he built the Whetstone building on the northeast corner of Clinton and Washington Street. And he operated there for many years. And that was known as the Sanxay Corner for years and years. Later, it became the Whetstone Corner. And I noticed that also down here, another Iowa City merchant that was very prominent. There were 4 generations of the Coast family who operated in banking circles and retail merchandising. A Coast clothing store was located on Clinton Street, just south of Iowa Book and Supply, and that is where Seifert's is today. The Coast family if you look in the sidewalk, you'll find the brass letters in front of Seifert's, the brass letters C-O-A-S-T, Coast. And they had a slogan that was very well known in the years they were in business. From coast to coast, you'll find no better clothes than Coast. And it was painted on the pier of the Rock Island Bridge over the Iowa River, right where Riverside Drive goes under it. On a wet day, sometimes you can still see the letters. But the Coast family were very, very prominent in Iowa City. Will Coast was a legislator. They owned property in all parts of the city. This is one of the old families, 4 generations. Now there are none of them in Iowa City. Now we'll go on over to, oh yes, I want to mention the, down in this red mausoleum, red roof mausoleum, is the James Mcallister family. That's where they are buried, and in the land, in the ground, just above the mausoleum. Mcallister, we talked about him and about the Showers family when we gave our program on Napoleon, which was 2 miles south of Iowa City on the Sand Road. So this is where the Mcallisters and the Showers are buried, right by the red-roofed mausoleum. Now we'll go on over to Governor Kirkwood's grave, which is just a little bit on the other side, up the hill a little bit. Thank you. I'm standing here by one of the most historic graves in Oakland Cemetery, the grave of Governor Samuel J. Kirkwood. I could also say Senator Samuel J. Kirkwood. You can always tell when you're at the Kirkwood grave because it has this great big round ball on the top. I never have learned what the significance of that is. Sometime I hope someone will tell me just what it means. Samuel Kirkwood was Iowa's Civil War governor. So the Civil War broke out when Kirkwood was in his 2nd term as Iowa governor. He later became governor of Iowa in 1875, and in between his sessions as governor of Iowa, he was U.S. Senator, and he was Secretary of the Interior. He was a very prominent man politically from the state of Iowa. Kirkwood was born in Maryland in 1813. When he was 21, his father moved to Ohio and took up farming. Kirkwood did some surveying at that time, and after a few years, he went into an attorney's office and studied law. That was the way many attorneys got started. They studied law in the office of an attorney. And after 2 years, he was admitted to the bar, and he practiced law in Ohio. He was active politically back there. And then he had a brother-in-law in Iowa City, Ezekiel Clark. Ezekiel Clark and Samuel Kirkwood had married Clark's sisters. Kirkwood had married Jane. And so he came out to visit Ezekiel Clark, and Clark showed him all of the potential of Iowa financially, commercially. And so Kirkwood decided the family would move here. So he gave up the practice of law in Ohio and came to Iowa when he was 42 years old. He started again at the age 42. And at first he was associated with Clark in the grist mill out at Carrollville. They also had a farm of 1,200 acres, a feed store in Iowa City, and they ground a lot of feed out there, not only for themselves, but for many people from miles and miles around. And then Kirkwood, who was very much the common man, was sort of, well, he was sort of urged by the people to run for governor, and so he did. And it's rather interesting. He was very much the common man always, and one time he was debating his opponent down in Washington, Iowa. And so the Democrats in Washington put their man in the finest carriage in town and had him driven up to the rostrum by 2 white horses. And so the Republicans, not wanting to be outdone with something dramatic, so they put Kirkwood on a lumber wagon and had it pulled by 2 yoke of oxen up to the rostrum. So it made the point that Kirkwood was the common man who put on no airs. Kirkwood was greatly loved by the soldiers in the Civil War. He treated them just as if they were his own sons. When he got the call from the President Lincoln for a regiment of men, he had no idea how he could equip, how he could finance them, whether he could even get a regiment. But he did without any trouble, and then he went to the state banks and he borrowed money on his own note so that these soldiers, when they went out to the Civil War, would go well equipped with the proper weapons. And the soldiers never forgot that. He was greatly loved by all of them. And that is attested by the fact this man Yavorski, who is buried over here, Frank Yavorski, he was one of Governor Kirkwood's soldiers, and he had a great love for the governor. When he came back, well, he'd had smallpox in the Civil War, and so he got a job as the caretaker at the pest house, which was on the far side of the cemetery. Now, you may not know what a pest house is, but that's where they used to take the people who had smallpox. It was highly contagious. It was a dreaded disease. And so they took the people as far away from civilization as they could. Yavorski had smallpox during the Civil War, so he was immune. So he took care of the people there. Well, when Yavorski died, he wanted to be buried as close to his governor, his leader, as he could be, and so he got this lot right next. Now, normally, the husband, as you face the grave, is buried on the right, the wife on the left. In other words, Samuel Kirkwood, as you face from the camera this way, is buried on the right, and Jane on the left. But in this case, Yavorski wanted to be as close to Kirkwood, to Samuel, as he could. So instead of being buried on the right side of his wife, he was buried on the left side. And if you look at the stone over here, you'll see that it was father. One of the happiest days in Kirkwood's life, I believe it was in 1893, he died in 1894, was one afternoon out at his home at 1101 Kirkwood Avenue. All of his old friends, ex-senators, ex-governors, judges, all the important people that he had known politically and commercially came to his house and paid their tributes to him on the front lawn. That was at 1101 Kirkwood. The house is still standing. Governor Kirkwood was a greatly loved governor. He was a great figure politically for the state of Iowa, and we have much to be proud with Governor Kirkwood. Yep. This is a rather dramatic personal story that I love to tell. In fact, I wrote it up for my series in the Press Citizen, 3 or 4 years ago. When I was in university, I had a friend by the name of Dwight Ueno. He was a swimmer. He was also a boxer. In fact, he was a university featherweight boxing champion. And he left Iowa City after he finished school, after he became a dentist. I didn't hear anything of him for many years. And then 20 years ago in the Press Citizen, there was a little note that Dwight Ueno had won the university flyweight boxing championship 20 years before. I clipped the article out, the 20 years ago column out, I mailed it to Dr. Dwight Ueno, Honolulu. I never heard anything from it. It never came back. And then about 4 years later, the phone rang one night about 10:30, and he was in Iowa City driving back from Annapolis to the West Coast, and then he was going to go to Hawaii. And he told me the story about the man that's buried here. Ueno came to the University of Iowa, and people kept asking him if he could play the Hawaiian guitar. Well, he said, I don't know what the Hawaiian guitar is. I never heard of it. So everybody kept asking him. It was very popular in the United States at that time. So he decided, well, if everybody's interested in the Hawaiian guitar, I better get one and learn to play it. So he made arrangements to where he would get a free Hawaiian guitar if he got a group of 6 other Hawaiian boys to buy guitars. So he got them, and they had a Hawaiian guitar orchestra. And they went out to Oakdale one time to play in a concert, and one of the patients there was a Chinese boy who was a student in the university. And he had contracted tuberculosis. There was no chance for him to recover, and he was worried about how he was going to be buried. He saw that Ueno was an Oriental. Ueno was Japanese, though he was from Hawaii. And he said to Ueno, "What am I going to do? I have no money. My people are over in Hunan, China. They have no money. I don't know how I'll be buried." And of course the Chinese make a great deal of the proper burial. And so Ueno said, "Well, I don't have any money either, but I'll see what I can do." So he went down and he talked to his landlady, Mrs. Whitaker. She lived on the just west of the women's gymnasium, on the northeast corner of Jefferson and Madison Street. And she always had Oriental boys or Hawaiian boys staying at her house. And she told Mrs. Whitaker about the plight of the Chinese boy, and Mrs. Whitaker said, "Well, I have an extra space on our family burial ground. He can be buried there." And so Ueno got word to the young man of the arrangement, and so he went back to Hawaii. He had never heard anything about what happened. So when he called me that night, he said he had been in Iowa City that afternoon, and he checked up, and he found that Mrs. Whitaker had lived up to her promise to have the boy buried, the Chinese boy buried on her lot. And he's buried right here. You'll see his name and the date that he died. And Mrs. Whitaker not only arranged for him to be buried here, but she took care of his funeral expenses. So it's a very, very touching story, and I always give credit to Mrs. Whitaker for being such a fine woman to take care of this boy, relieve his worries about where he was going to be buried. I'm standing here beside the celebrated Black Angel, undoubtedly the most striking, the most dramatic monument in Oakland Cemetery. And probably it's the most talked about, written about monument in the state of Iowa. I don't know that for sure, but I never have seen any monument written about as consistently as this is. Every couple of years there's another article about it. I've written about it 2 or 3 times in my articles in the Iowa City Press Citizen. But the monument was erected in 1912 by Teresa Dolezal Feldevert. Dolezal was her first marriage. Her second marriage was to Feldevert. She came to the United States from Bohemia, and she had been a doctor in Bohemia, having taken part of her training in Vienna. When she got to the United States, to Iowa, her credentials were not accepted, and she could not practice as an MD. But she did work as a midwife in Iowa City. She lived here for many years, and her son Eddie, who was a drug clerk, died when he was, I believe, about 21, and he is buried in this monument over here that looks like part of a tree. Eddie was buried in another part of the cemetery. And then when Mrs. Feldevert had this monument erected, she moved his remains over here, and he's buried underneath the Black Angel. Mrs. Feldevert married a man named Feldevert out in Oregon, and she was gone for a few years. And when he died in 1911, she came back, and she arranged to have this monument sculptured in Chicago and cast in brass. She paid $5,000 for it, and she was not a wealthy woman, not by any means. She died November 18th, 1924, but the date on her death is not on here. I presume because there was no one left who took the interest in that. However, I do see that there is a geranium and some flowers planted at the foot of the grave. Well, there are countless people come out here to look at the Black Angel again and again. I came out one Sunday afternoon, 6, 7 years ago, to take some pictures of the Black Angel. And when I got here, there was a wedding being arranged. The bride was wearing her grandmother's wedding gown, and the groom was wearing a white tuxedo. They were university students. And I came up and I said, would you mind, would you like or not like for me to take your pictures? Oh, they'd love to have me take their pictures. So I took their pictures and I ran a story about the marriage in front of the Black Angel in one of my Press Citizen articles. So they had an orchestra here, they had their friends, they had the minister, of course, and it was quite a interesting wedding. I think maybe there was another wedding out here, but of course there have been many people out here examining this. When I talked to the bride, I said, you know the tradition of the Black Angel and the University of Iowa co-eds? No, she didn't know. I said, well, no co-ed is a true co-ed, according to the legend, until she's been kissed under the Black Angel. The bride says, I will take care of that. I brought my two granddaughters out here to see this, and of course they were fascinated with it, and they were quite interested in the epitaph that's on this side here. It's in Bohemian. I never had taken the time to get it translated, but my oldest granddaughter, Ingrid, said she had a Bohemian friend, and she would have it translated. So she had it translated and sent me a copy of it. So the Black Angel is one of the most celebrated tombstones, I'm sure, in the state. And why? Of course, one of the things that people always wonder is why did the Black Angel turn black? It was bronze when it was cast. It was bronze when it was put up here. Some people said it was laid in a barn for 10 years. Now, that's not true, because I talked to the lady who lived in the brick house over here, and she said she saw them put it up right after it came in. She said her brother and her father worked on the Rock Island Railroad. The monument was brought in on a flat car. They washed it down there, and then they brought it up on two trucks. Well, they were drays. They weren't trucks then. They didn't have automobiles or trucks, gas engine trucks then. So they put it up. It's quite a job to get it mounted, but she said no, it was bronze when it was put up. And of course the legends are that it turned black because of the sins of Teresa Dolezal-Feldoverd, or it turned, others say it was turned black because of the sins of some other members of the family. And there are a host of, there are legion legends as to why it turned black. Actually, it turned black because bronze turns black when it's exposed to the elements for many years, as this was. We're now in the Graceland Section of Oakland Cemetery. This is sometimes called the University Section because there are so many university professors, university presidents over here. I'm standing now right beside the stone of Walter Albert Jessup, who was president of the university from 1916 to 1934. He accomplished a great deal for the university during those years. And in the distance over here, the large stone is that of Virgil Melvin Hancher, who was president of the university from 1940 to 1964. He was president of the university longer than any other man. There are many, oh yes, and down on the far side is the grave of Chester Phillips, Chester A. Phillips, who was dean of the College of Commerce for many, many years, and who was acting president of the university at one time. Phillips Hall is named for him. And over here is the stone of Dr. Everett Dudley Plass. And there are many, many professors in this area. Here's Philip Greeley Clapp's stone. Clapp was in the music department, and you can see the music cleft in one corner of his stone, and then the words from Keats, music's golden tongue. And next to him is the grave of Dorrance White, and you see he has 4 Latin words on his stone. I will not take the time to translate them for you at the moment. He has a daughter, Mrs. Fred Failing, in Iowa City, and his son is in Iowa City also. And then if we look over this way, we'll find many other university doctors and professors. In the distance over here is Dr. Greenleaf, who was an Iowa City physician. Professor Perry Bardwell over here, who was in the College of Law. Dr. Alcock, and also in the College of Law, Paul Sayre. And here is Elmer Hills, who was in the College of Commerce for many, many years. Dr. Carnog, who was in the College of Medicine. Dr. Ingram. And over here is the famous Dr. Steinler, who was in the what was called the Children's Hospital, orthopedics, for many years. He had world renown. A little further over is Dr. Doolin, who was an Iowa City doctor. Oh, there are just many, many university people up here. However, they're not all university. My parents are buried over here in this section, and there are many, many others, but it seems like it has a predominance of university professors, and many of them are very outstanding, and presidents. In the far section of the cemetery is the grave of Professor or Dean Amos Currier, who was acting president of the university at one time. Currier Hall, which was built in 1912, was named for him. Well, now we're going... This is the Arthur Pickering family stone. It's of particular interest because this is one of the 4 columns that was in front of Close Hall, which was the University YMCA, built in 1890. Pickering was a motorman on Iowa City streetcars for decades, and for many years he would drive past Close Hall with his streetcar. He always admired these stones. I called on him just a couple of years before his death in 1976, and he told me that he was so anxious to get this that he called President Hansher and asked if he could buy it because he wanted it for a stone for his cemetery lot. President Hansher agreed that he could buy it. So this is the Pickering stone. The family was a long time Iowa City family. They came from England. They operated a China store for many years in Iowa City, first in Close Hall and later in the building at 117 East College Street. So the Pickering family is a long family in Iowa City. This concludes our walk through Oakland Cemetery, through the history of Iowa City, Johnson County, and the state of Iowa. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I. Next month, we will make the same trip, this time through St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery, the old section and the new section, through Memory Gardens, and through the Jewish Cemetery. Thank you very much.